If you haven't watched even one Disney movie throughout your childhood, there's something terribly wrong with you. I was a Disney fanatic, and I truly mean that. Growing up, it was the only thing I ever watched. Most kids, especially 10 or 11 years old, would switch the television to Baywatch or Desperate Housewives, something their parents would prohibit them from when no one is at home. But I was perfectly happy with my Pinocchio and Lady and the Tramp, thank you very much. The only explanation I can have for my obsession is that I'm an only child, so naturally the TV does become your best friend. I've never traveled much. Both my parents research on medicine and therapy for cancer, so work is not considered something that is scheduled. They usually work weekends too, and when they don't, it's a cause to celebrate. Basically, all I know is Australia. The last trip we took was to Gold Coast 2 years ago. In recent years, however, the research has progressed much more, which means my parents need to clock in more hours. I've never pestered my parents to go out of their way for leisure. I know they're too stressed with their jobs for that. 6 months ago, the Fangs moved in next door. Just having migrated from Hong Kong, the Fangs seemed pleasant enough. We'd met them a total of 4 times, which says quite a bit for my parents. Mr. and Mrs. Fang have 2 kids, Lynn and Anne. Anne was 7, and Lynn was 2 months elder to me. Upon our second meeting or so, I immediately struck up a friendship with the kids. We began to talk about TV, and soon I learned that the girls loved Disney as much as I did. Once after school, I'd even gone to their house to see their Disney collectibles. I was awestruck. When my parents realized I was getting closer to the Fangs, they decided to strengthen the friendship. So the following Sunday, they invited the family home to dinner. Thoroughly excited, I grabbed my entire Disney movie collection ready to discuss and maybe watch a movie or two, if time permitted. As my parents prepared the meal and set the place up, I rambled on and on with what my playdates consisted of with Anne and Lynn. My parents feigned interest quite well, although I could see how tired their eyes were. They were, for the most part, hosting this dinner for me. They were happy to see how happy I was. As an 11-year-old, I could read people quite well. When the Fangs arrived, I stole the kids away to my room. To my excitement, they'd brought their collectibles and cartoon figures as well. "Have you ever been to Disneyland?" Anne asked me. "No," I said. "I've never left the country. Have you?" "Yeah, we used to live 4 hours away from the Disneyland in Hong Kong," Lynn said. My mouth dropped open. "What's it like?" I whispered. "It's magical. We've been at least 8 or 9 times," Lynn giggled. We got called for dinner shortly after, and at the dinner table, I blurted out my newfound information to my parents. "Mom, Dad, did you know the Fangs have been to Disneyland at least 9 times? Mrs. Fang smiled warmly. "Oh yes, the kids absolutely love the place. We used to make it a point to go on at least one of their birthdays." I looked on in amazement. "Can I see some pictures?" "Sure, I've got them on my phone. I'll email them to your mom when I've got time." "You know," started Mrs. Fang, "we're going back to Hong Kong next month for the Easter vacation. We've got some visa stuff to tie up, so it'll be a short trip. We'd be happy to take Blair with us and show her Disneyland, if she'd like to see it." A silence took over the table. I whipped my head towards my parents. My parents raised their eyebrows and were quite surprised with the offer. Lynn broke the silence. "Oh my God, please can you send Blair, Mr. Crawford? Please," she pleaded. Dad laughed. "We'd have to consider it, but it does sound quite fantastic. Would you be interested?" he asked me. "Is that even a question?" I cried. Okay. Let's discuss it with a rational mind," Mom joked. "We'll let you know, Pan. Thanks for the offer, though." "No problem. We'd love to have her. I'm sure the kids would love some company this time. To be frank, we wouldn't have visited the park this year, but I think this is a special occasion," Mrs. Fang said. After the Fangs left that night, I burst out with all my excitement. My parents had a long discussion about it and agreed to send me. They said they would go over the specifics with the Fangs, but they think it'll be quite a journey for me to go on, especially since I've never really traveled, and they doubt they'd have time to take me anywhere for a while. We were set to leave in 3 weeks, but I wasn't in the right mind to focus on school or anything related. All day I would look at pictures of Disneyland on Google and browse through the popular theme park attractions and entertainment acts that I would want to experience. I knew Lynn and Ann would know best, but I was too excited to care. Time flew, and I found myself outside the gates of Disneyland. That week in Hong Kong had been comparatively boring. Mr. and Mrs. Fang were indulged in visa work, and the kids and I had to stay back at the hotel. I realized I didn't have much in common with the girls, and I was secretly thankful the trip was only going to last a week. Plus, they were saving the best for last. I hadn't woken up in time for breakfast that day, so Mr. and Mrs. Fang were nice enough to bring my breakfast to the room. I ate up, because I knew it would be an eventful day and I needed the energy. We were there on a Friday, so the park was semi-packed. We stood in line to get our tickets, and a range of emotions overtook me. It was the overwhelm of living my childhood dream, paired with a culture shock of being in an entirely new territory. I hung on to the way people spoke and paid attention to their dialect and the way their tongues clicked with unfamiliar sounds. Maybe I would learn Mandarin when I'm older. I made a mental note. I liked the way the language sounded. There was a family of 5 in front of us in the line, and it struck me as odd that none of them were talking. They were simply standing there and robotically moving their feet as the people ahead of them gave way. Their heads were focused on what was in front of them, and they never looked up to see what was happening around them. Maybe they've been there too many times, I thought, and shrugged it off. However, when they bought their tickets, they mumbled to the guy at the counter. I was right behind them, and it was inaudible to me. I wondered how a guy across a glass heard them. Mr. Fang cut through me and bought the tickets for us. We entered at the gates, and I was squealing to the girls, forgetting all about the strange family in front of us. What do we see first? Where do we go first? Which ride do we go on first? I pored over the map that I had grabbed from the entrance. Shall we get some ice cream first? Mrs. Fang suggested with a laugh. You girls need to get some food in your system before we begin the festivities. Yes, screeched Anne, and we all followed Mr. and Mrs. Fang to the ice cream stand in tow. As he ordered, I skimmed over the map and noticed something strange. I had visited the Disneyland website almost every day back in Australia. I knew all the rides, shows, and attractions by heart. Somehow, I couldn't find any of it on the map. There were similarities, but not one name or item was exactly the same. Lynn noticed my silence and said, "You know, I know the map by heart. You don't have to look through it so intensely." "I know," I mumbled, "but I can't find anything that I'd seen online. I mean, they were all different on the website. For example, Mystic Land wasn't Mystery Land." Lynn looked at the map over my shoulder. That's strange. Are you sure you were on the right website? I heard that all Disneyland parks are not always consistent. Cultural and geographical differences or whatever. I bet you were on Florida Disneyland's website. I reluctantly agreed with her and rolled the map up. I guess we don't need this anymore, since you guys know it by heart, I joked. She giggled and linked her arm with mine. Let's go to Grizzly Gore first, she suggested. It's the closest to where we are. I flinched at the name she mentioned, but nodded, and the 5 of us set off. My excitement was deteriorating at a lagging pace, as I definitely noticed certain unusual things. Children were holding black balloons. The water in the fountains that were passed were distinctly murky, the color of old tea, and disturbingly, there was no face on the Mickey Mouse statues that we passed. His clothes were detailed, but his face was completely blank. I couldn't let that pass, so I asked Lynn about it. What? That's how it's always been, she shrugged. Why aren't you more excited? I thought you'd been dying to get here. I am, I said, absent-mindedly, looking around. I didn't anticipate this. I realized there was no gain in telling the Fangs about my observations and how strange I found it all. They were jovial as ever, and everyone else looked undisturbed too. I wondered if something was wrong with me, or with them. Was it because I'd never been here before? Is this how it's really always been? What do I know? I'm leaving my country for the first time. I haven't had enough exposure and experience to make these kind of judgments. I shrug off my misconceptions and appreciate the fact that I'm living my childhood dream. I forcefully ignored anything out of the ordinary, things that I knew definitely shouldn't be there. I put on a brave face and showed the fangs I appreciated the fact that they brought me here. But I forgot about all that when I met Snow White. Character experiences were common all through the park, but this was the first one we'd had. One look at her, and I immediately knew something was wrong. Her mascara was smudged and ran down her cheeks as though she'd been crying. Her eyes were red and puffy, her lipstick sloppily lined her mouth. She had a gash on her neck, which was freshly clotting up. Her hair was unevenly cut and her clothes had been subtly torn. She smiled in a sick way at the kids around her as they posed for pictures together. Maybe Lynn was right about cultural differences, but this was way too far-fetched. I may not know Hong Kong, but I know Disney, and Disney characters aren't supposed to look like that. I felt queasy in my stomach, especially when Anne pulled me to take a picture with her. "Your parents would love to see this," Mrs. Fang smiled. I stood next to the deranged Snow White, and it took everything in me not to throw up. She smelled of spoiled milk and an unwashed dog. We kept walking until we came across the first ride, the Mad Teacups. I didn't type it wrong, and you read it right. When I looked at the people on the ride, I felt goosebumps rise in my arm. Not from the adrenaline of watching a fast-paced ride, but rather the strange feeling of dread I'd been feeling the entire day. It was at a peak at the moment. Every single person on the ride was unconscious, heads lolling in the direction that the teacups would take them, and there was no screams or shouts of excitement that usually explode from an enjoyable ride. "I don't want to try that out," I blurted. I was getting tired of the calm front I was putting up for the Fangs. Mr. Fang looked at me curiously. "Do you have a fear of rides, dear?" "Just this one," I thought. I nodded. "I'm not feeling too well." Mrs. Fang bit her lip and looked concerned. "Oh no, should we be worried?" A little too late for that. I shook my head and tried to gulp my nausea away. "Okay, we have two options," Anne said. "We can go to the Rapsy River Cruise, or we can go watch Disney Deadlock evening show." The river cruise sounded deadly, plus I didn't want to be traveling on water, what with my feelings of unease. I opted for the Disney show, wondering what on earth the name indicated. Walking in, I knew to expect the worst. I knew it wouldn't be an average happy-go-lucky, rekindle your childhood memories Disney movie fiesta. This entire experience was abnormal. I wasn't even sure if this was really happening at this point. The audience at the show was quiet. And I don't mean the low chatter, soft whispers kind of quiet. I mean dead silence, not one word. The only sound was the spectators shuffling into the theater. None of the Fangs spoke either. They were silently looking around at other people, at the dark, empty stage. I did the same. I didn't feel like talking. Maybe I should just go to sleep. I snapped from my ephemeral slumber as something similar to classical music started to blare over the speakers. I don't know much about orchestras or old music, but it sounded like I was at the opera. The music was highly unfitting. It wasn't Disney in any sense. I knew every soundtrack in every movie, and I had never heard this before. It didn't sound Asian either. Shocked didn't even cut how I was feeling at this point, though. I was tired of being shocked. My thoughts were cut off when all my favorite Disney characters showing up on stage. Here were all the classical cartoon characters right in front of me, except they weren't. Mickey, Minnie, Donald, Goofy, and Daisy were wearing their clothes, but they had no color. Dressed in all black and white, they were miming their actions. The music got louder every second, but the story itself, however, was difficult to ignore. I can't remember everything, but it ran on the lines of Daisy wanting to commit suicide and Mickey helping her. On the side of the stage, it appeared as though Donald and Goofy were raping Minnie, who was vigorously resisting the duo, mutely. The music became sadder and sadder until it stopped when Daisy succeeded in committing suicide. No, she actually did. The actor who was wearing the suit cut through it and stabbed herself in the stomach multiple times. The first row of the audience was engulfed in blood. It was at this point I started screaming. I screamed until all the air in my lungs would allow it, and my vision started to blur. The shock and horror was too much. Being away from my parents, being in an entirely new country with people I hadn't even known for a year, to having all my childhood dreams rattled in the span of a day, and watching people die right in front of me. It was too much. I knew I was going to pass out from the shock, from the pain, from the dread. From the moment I'd stepped in Disneyland, I felt unsafe. It was like I wasn't supposed to be there, like I'd been doing myself a great wrong. I can't remember when I stopped screaming. I can't remember much after that. All I can tell you is that when the paramedics arrived to take me away, they found 150 micrograms of acid in my system. Today's No Sleep story comes from username sakiliya. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. And sweet dreams.